It was a cool and clear Saturday morning in Pinecrest Meadows. This neighborhood, known for its tranquility and exclusivity, looked like something out of a postcard. The impeccably clean streets were lined with meticulously maintained lawns, where shades of green gleamed under the soft sunlight. The modern villas that adorned the landscape seemed to compete in elegance, each with its own character, yet united by an almost intimidating air of perfection. Not subscribed yet? Join our community by clicking on subscribe and activate the bell icon to get notified every time there's a new video. Claire Thompson, a 42-year-old woman, stood at her driveway with a broom in hand and a light smile on her face. Dressed in a blue t-shirt and athletic pants, her curly hair tied up in a simple bun, Claire radiated a calm yet determined energy. She had spent 2 decades serving in the US military, leading missions in some of the world's most challenging regions. But now, after years of military discipline and personal sacrifices, she was finally embarking on a new chapter of her life, transitioning to civilian life. Buying this house had been more than just a financial transaction. For Claire, it represented a symbol of personal victory, effort, and dedication. Every corner of this property was a reminder of how far she had come. It had been her dream for a long time to have a place to call home, and now that dream had become a reality. The morning air was filled with the sound of birds singing, mixed with the soft rustling of leaves swayed by the breeze. Claire began sweeping her driveway with rhythmic movements, feeling a peace that had eluded her for years. But that tranquility wouldn't last long. The sound of an engine breaking the silence made Claire look up. A patrol car, white with black, detailing, was slowly driving down the street. The vehicle slowed as it approached her property, and Claire noticed the 3 officers inside. The gaze of their leader, a broad-shouldered man with a sharp jawline who radiated authority, locked onto her from behind his dark sunglasses. It was Officer Ryan Miller. "Look at this," Miller murmured, leaning toward his partner in the passenger seat. His voice carried a mix of surprise and suspicion. Beside him, Officer David Brooks, a burly man with a permanent smirk that seemed more mocking than friendly, let out a low chuckle. "Well, that's not something you see every day," he said, making no effort to disguise his condescending tone. From the back seat, Officer Eric Carter, younger and visibly less confident, leaned forward, observing Claire with curiosity. "Maybe she works here," Carter suggested quietly, trying to soften the moment. Miller smirked slightly and brought the car to a stop in front of Claire's driveway. "There's only one way to find out." Claire felt her grip on the broom tighten. There was something in the way they were looking at her that set off an internal alarm, a feeling she wasn't unfamiliar with, but had hoped she wouldn't have to experience in this new chapter of her life. Determined to stay calm, she set the broom aside as the officers stepped out of the car. Miller and Brooks walked toward her driveway with deliberate steps, while Carter hesitated before following. Claire straightened up, her posture calm yet firm, watching as they approached. "Good morning," Miller began, his tone more interrogative than cordial. "What are you doing here?" Claire raised an eyebrow, surprised by the question, but maintained her composure. "I'm cleaning my driveway," she replied calmly, her voice measured yet firm. Brooks let out a brief laugh and glanced at Miller. "Says it's her house." Miller crossed his arms over his chest, his sunglasses reflecting the sunlight. "Why don't you show us some ID, just to clear things up?" Claire's expression hardened slightly. "I don't have to show you anything," she responded, her tone now firmer. "This is my property, and I haven't done anything wrong." Brooks took a step forward, his mocking smirk fading. "Look, we've had reports of suspicious activity in this area. How do we know you didn't just show up here?" Claire pressed. Her lips together, her patience beginning to wear thin. "That's ridiculous. I moved in 3 days ago. If there were any issues, I would have already received a notice." Carter, clearly uncomfortable with the way the conversation was unfolding, glanced at his colleagues. "Maybe we should go," he suggested quietly, but Miller ignored him. "If this really is your house, you won't mind if we take a look inside," Miller said, with a smile that was anything but friendly. Claire crossed her arms, her frustration growing. "Unless you have a warrant, you're not going in." Miller's face hardened. "Are you sure about that? We just want to confirm that everything is in order. No need to make this difficult." Claire held his gaze, her years of military training helping her stand her ground. "I know my rights. Officer, unless you have legitimate cause, I suggest you leave." The tension in the air was palpable. Miller looked at Brooks and nodded toward the house. "Check it out." Claire felt her heart pound as Brooks and Carter headed toward the door, but instead of backing down, she stood firm, her eyes locked onto Miller. "This isn't over," Claire said, her voice calm yet filled with determination. The footsteps of Officers David Brooks and Eric Carter echoed on the polished wooden floor as they crossed the threshold of the front door. The house, still with unpacked boxes, emanated a sense of order and structure, a reflection of its owner. Every object seemed to be carefully placed, from the clean-lined curtains to the functional yet elegant furniture. However, there was something else in the space, a solemn, almost military atmosphere that spoke of discipline and purpose. Click on subscribe and activate notifications. That way, you'll stay up to date with our upcoming videos and won't miss a thing. Carter, moving cautiously, couldn't shake off the discomfort creeping up his spine. His eyes scanned the living room, where military plaques, framed certificates, and photographs covered an entire wall. One image caught his attention: Claire, in full-dress uniform, standing beside the city's mayor and the chief of police at an official ceremony. "This doesn't look like the home of someone who just showed up here," Carter murmured. His voice filled with unease. Brooks shrugged, though his initial confidence had waned. "Let's make sure. Check the back." As Carter made his way toward the kitchen, Brooks advanced into the main living area. His eyes took in the perfectly aligned medals on the wall, a silent reminder of Claire's years of service. Though his expression remained neutral, something in his stance suggested he was beginning to grasp the severity of their mistake. Outside the house, Claire remained standing in front of Miller, whose intimidating posture failed to unnerve her. Years of leading soldiers under fire had prepared her for men like him. But this was different. This wasn't a military mission. This was her home, her safe space, and now it was being invaded. "You think I don't belong here?" Claire asked, her voice firm, devoid of fear. Miller shrugged, a dry smile on his face. "You're reading too much into this. We're just doing our job." Claire narrowed her eyes. "Does your job include harassing people in their own homes?" Miller stepped closer, resting a hand on the holster of his gun. "Look, lady, cooperation always helps." Claire felt her patience thinning. "So does respect. But it seems that's not in your manual." Miller clenched his jaw, his tone turning sharper. "Watch your tone." Inside the house, Carter returned to the living room, where Brooks was still frozen in front of the memorabilia wall. "This is a mistake," Carter muttered, his voice barely audible. Brooks nodded, but before he could respond, something caught his attention. A plaque displaying Claire's rank. "She's a major in the army," Brooks whispered. Then he pointed at the photograph of Claire standing with the chief of police. "And she's connected, very connected." Carter, who had been scanning a side table, found a stack of mail. Every letter was addressed to Claire Thompson. "This doesn't look good," he murmured. Now visibly nervous, Brooks reached for his radio. "Miller, we have a problem," he said, his voice tense. Outside, Miller grabbed the radio on his shoulder, frowning. "What is it?" There was a brief silence before Brooks replied. "She's a major in the army, and she's connected to the chief of police and the mayor." For a moment, Miller's face betrayed a flicker of doubt, but he quickly masked it with his usual hardened expression. Claire, watching the exchange, crossed her arms, her gaze locked onto the officer. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her tone cold. Miller ignored her question and spoke into the radio. "Get out of there now." Moments later, Brooks and Carter emerged from the house, their expressions completely changed. Brooks avoided looking at Claire, while Carter seemed on the verge of apologizing. "Miller," Brooks began, stepping closer to whisper, "we need to leave." Miller shot him a glare. "Why?" Brooks tilted his head toward Claire. "She has connections. If this goes sideways, we're in serious trouble." Miller gritted his teeth, his frustration evident. "So what? Does that mean she's untouchable?" Claire stepped in, her voice as commanding as an order. "It means you've made a grave mistake." For a moment, the three officers stood in silence. The tension in the air was so thick it felt suffocating. Finally, Carter stepped forward. "Miller, I think we should go," he said quietly, trying to de-escalate the situation, but Miller wasn't ready to back down. In one swift motion, he drew his gun, pointing it directly at Claire. "Sit down now." Claire's heart pounded, but her military training kept her calm. Slowly, she raised her hands, pulling a gun on an unarmed woman in her own home. "Very brave of you," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Carter stepped forward, panic in his voice. "Miller, lower your weapon. This is getting out of control." "I'm in charge here," Miller growled, gripping the gun tighter. "No," Claire countered, her eyes locked onto his. "You've already lost." For a moment it seemed like Miller was going to pull the trigger, but Brooks, realizing just how close this situation was to exploding, placed a firm hand on his partner's arm. "Miller, enough. We need to go. Now." Reluctantly, Miller lowered the gun, but his expression was filled with barely contained rage. "Get off my property," Claire ordered, pointing toward the patrol car. Without another word, the three officers returned to their vehicle. Claire watched them leave, her posture rigid, though her hands trembled slightly. Once the car disappeared from sight, Claire stepped inside and locked the door. She walked straight to her computer, pulling up the security footage. The entire encounter, every word, every gesture had been recorded. She saved the file and reached for her phone. "This is Major Claire Thompson," she said, her voice firm as she answered the sheriff's department operator. "I want to report an incident of police misconduct." She hung up, her jaw tight. This wasn't over, not even close. At the first light of the following morning, Claire Thompson prepared herself with meticulous precision. Her dress uniform, with every medal and insignia perfectly in place, was a testament to the years she had dedicated to serving her country. As she looked at herself in the mirror, her expression reflected nothing but determination. This wasn't a battlefield fight, but the fight for justice required the same discipline and conviction. When she walked into the Pinecrest County Sheriff's Office, the atmosphere shifted instantly. Conversations halted, and every gaze turned toward her. Her commanding presence, reinforced by the gleam of her decorations, made it clear she wasn't there to accept excuses. "Good morning, I'm Major Claire Thompson. I have an appointment with Sheriff Mark Hayes," she said as she approached the reception desk. The receptionist, a young woman who suddenly looked nervous, quickly nodded. "Yes, ma'am. I mean, Major. Thompson, the sheriff is expecting you. Second door to the left." "Thank you," Claire responded politely, though her voice remained firm. Upon entering the sheriff's office, Mark Hayes immediately stood up. A tall man in his 50s, with salt and pepper hair, Hayes exuded a calm authority. However, the concern in his expression was unmistakable. "Major Thompson, it's an honor to meet you," he said, extending his hand. Claire shook it, but did not. "Sit down. Sheriff Hayes, I'm not here for pleasantries. I have evidence of a serious incident involving 3 of your officers." With those words, she placed a USB drive on his desk. Hayes raised an eyebrow and took the device. "Please go on." Claire recounted the events of the previous day with military precision, from the moment the officers pulled up in front of her house to when Miller drew his gun. As she spoke, Hayes plugged the USB drive into his computer and began reviewing the security footage. The video captured every detail: the condescending expressions, the inappropriate remarks, the unauthorized entry into her home, and the moment Miller aimed his weapon at her. When the footage ended, Hayes leaned back in his chair, letting out a long sigh. "This is unacceptable," he finally said, his voice heavy with seriousness. "I can't believe this happened under my watch." "It did," Claire responded, her tone controlled but cold. "And I expect you to take action. If you don't, I'll take this to higher authorities and the press." Hayes nodded slowly, his expression firm. "You won't have to. I'll make sure this is addressed immediately. The officers involved will be suspended today while we conduct a full investigation." Claire held his gaze, assessing his sincerity. "I hope you follow through, Sheriff. This isn't just about me. It's about accountability." "You have my word," Hayes replied, standing up to shake her hand again. That same afternoon, officers Ryan Miller, David Brooks, and Eric Carter were called into the department's Human Resources office. Each was handed an immediate suspension, notice pending an internal investigation. Brooks, who had shown growing discomfort throughout the entire incident, accepted the suspension without protest, avoiding eye contact with his superiors. Carter, visibly shaken, nodded in silence, his expression reflecting both regret and concern. But Miller didn't take the news as calmly. "This is ridiculous," he shouted, slamming his fist on the desk. "We were just doing our job." The HR manager remained composed. "Your actions were recorded, Officer Miller. You have the right to appeal, but based on the evidence, this is a serious matter. I suggest you seek legal counsel." Miller stormed out of the office, muttering expletives under his breath, while Brooks and Carter followed quietly. 2 days later, Claire received a call from Sheriff Hayes. "Major Thompson, I wanted to inform you that the officers have been suspended and the investigation is underway. This will be a transparent and thorough process." Claire's voice remained measured. "Thank you, Sheriff. I trust you will see this through." But the situation didn't end there. The security footage, which Hayes shared as part of his commitment to transparency, soon began circulating online. Local media picked up the story, and within days it became a nationwide topic of discussion. Public outrage spread rapidly. The videos, showing undeniable evidence of the officers' abuse of power and bias, sparked debates on police conduct and racial profiling. Advocacy groups began organizing protests, demanding reforms and greater oversight of law enforcement. Want more content like this? Then hit like, subscribe, and activate the notification bell, because there's always fresh content here and you won't want to miss out. Meanwhile, Claire kept a low profile, declining most interview requests. Her focus was on ensuring justice was served, not on seeking publicity. One night, as she watched the news covering the incident, she received a text message from a close friend. "You've started something important. Keep going." Claire read the message and smiled slightly. She knew the fight wasn't over, but she was ready for whatever came next. As the story gained traction in the media, Claire watched as the incident ignited heated discussions. On news programs and online forums, footage of the officers entering her home and of Miller pointing a gun at her fueled a wave of national outrage. People from across the country flooded comment sections, demanding urgent reforms, while more conservative voices attempted to defend the officers' actions, arguing that they were merely doing their job. However, the evidence was overwhelming and difficult to refute. In Pinecrest Meadows, reactions were mixed. Some neighbors, moved by guilt or remorse, began to approach Claire. One afternoon, while she was working in her garden, an elderly couple who lived a few houses away stopped by her fence. The woman, looking nervous, offered her a homemade pie. Claire accepted the gesture politely, though it was clear that words did not come easily to them. Amidst hesitant apologies, they admitted that they had remained silent for too long and regretted not doing more to support her from the beginning. Although Claire appreciated their honesty, she knew this was only a small step in a much larger problem. Sheriff Hayes, for his part, was facing mounting pressure. Protests in front of the police department became constant, with signs demanding justice and reform. In an attempt to ease public discontent, Hayes announced a press conference. On the morning of the event, Claire was invited to participate. Although she hesitated at first, she ultimately decided to attend. She knew her presence was not just symbolic. It was a statement that she would not be intimidated or silenced. The hall where the conference took place was packed with journalists, activists, and community members. Cameras flashed continuously as Hayes stepped up to the podium. His speech was direct, acknowledging the failures of his department and promising concrete measures to prevent a similar incident from happening again. When he finished, the sheriff invited Claire to say a few words. The room fell into absolute silence as she approached the microphone. With a firm posture and a determined gaze, Claire spoke from the heart. She described not only the incident she had experienced, but also how it represented a reality that many people faced in silence. Her voice was calm, but carried a strength that commanded attention. She pointed out that she was not seeking only individual punishments, but structural changes to ensure that abuses of power would not be repeated. Her words resonated deeply, generating an ovation that made it clear she had struck a chord with the audience. The following days were marked by intense scrutiny. Under increasing public pressure, Hayes implemented several reforms within the department. These included a mandatory training program on implicit biases and de-escalation techniques, the use of body cameras in all public interactions, and the creation of a community review board to oversee complaints against officers. While these measures were seen as a step in the right direction, Claire knew that true change required much more than policies. A cultural shift was needed, a restructuring of values within institutions. Meanwhile, Ryan Miller's case moved forward to the courts. On the day of the trial, the courtroom was packed with spectators and media outlets. Claire, once again dressed in her military uniform, gave a clear and compelling testimony, detailing every moment of the incident. When the security footage was played, the impact on the jury was evident. Miller's defense tried to justify his actions by claiming he acted under stress, but the evidence was too overwhelming. After a brief deliberation, the jury found him guilty of misconduct and excessive use of force. The sentence was 4 years in prison, a decision many considered fair, though for Claire, the real victory lay in the attention the case had brought to broader systemic issues. As the weeks passed, Claire's story became a symbol of resilience and change. She was invited to events and forums where she shared her experience and advocated for broader reforms. Though she preferred to maintain a low profile, she understood the importance of using her voice to inspire and educate others. At one of these events, a young student approached her, confessing that she had decided to study criminal justice after hearing Claire's story. Moments like that reminded Claire that every action, no matter how small it seemed, could have a profound impact. Back in Pinecrest Meadows, life was beginning to regain a semblance of normalcy, but the neighborhood was no longer the same. Conversations among residents were more open, and the invisible barriers that had existed for so long were starting to crumble. Claire, though still reserved, actively participated in community meetings, helping to build an environment where everyone felt included. One afternoon, as she sat on her porch, a young girl from the neighborhood timidly approached to offer her a drawing. It was a depiction of Claire in her uniform, surrounded by smiling people. Claire smiled, thanking the child, touched by the innocence and hope reflected in her eyes. Despite everything that had happened, Claire knew that the fight for justice had no endpoint. It was a continuous effort, a series of small but significant steps that over time could build a more equitable world. As she watched the sun set, behind the perfectly aligned houses in her neighborhood, Claire felt a renewed sense of purpose. No matter how long the road was, she was willing to walk it, knowing that every step counted. During the trial, the details of the case not only exposed Ryan Miller's actions, but also shed light on structural failures within the police department. Witnesses who had previously remained silent began to come forward, recounting similar experiences of abuse of power and discrimination. These testimonies expanded the scope of the trial, turning it into a public examination of the policing system as a whole. Claire, though steadfast in her commitment to justice, could not help but feel emotionally drained. Every time she took the stand to answer questions or relive the incident, she felt a mixture of determination and exhaustion. But something kept pushing her forward. The idea that her fight was not just for herself, but for all those who had faced similar situations without the opportunity to defend themselves. When the guilty verdict was read against Miller, the courtroom fell into tense silence. The judge's voice echoed through the space, explaining that the abuse of power had not only violated Claire's rights, but had also undermined public trust in the institutions meant to protect the community. As Miller was escorted out of the courtroom, Claire watched him with a mix of relief and resignation. Though justice had been served in her case, she knew there was still much work to be done. The impact of the trial was felt throughout the county. The reforms implemented by Sheriff Hayes began to show tangible results. The creation of a community oversight board allowed citizens to have an active voice in police accountability. Additionally, training sessions on implicit biases and de-escalation techniques became mandatory, and body cameras, now a standard requirement, began to restore trust in everyday interactions between law enforcement and civilians. Claire, while satisfied with these advances, remained cautious. In meetings with activists and community leaders, she emphasized that policies were just the beginning. Real change doesn't come just from new rules, she would say. It comes from a constant commitment to challenging biases and building empathy, both inside and outside institutions. In the months that followed, Claire's story became a national symbol. She was invited to speak at universities, conferences, and television programs, where she not only shared her experience, but also her vision for a more just future. Though she preferred to stay out of the spotlight, she understood that her voice carried power she couldn't ignore. One night, as she reviewed her notes for an upcoming event, she received a handwritten letter. It was from a young police officer in another state who admitted that her story had inspired him to approach his job with a renewed sense of integrity and respect for human rights. Claire read the letter multiple times, feeling deeply moved. Though the road was long, moments like this reminded her that every effort was worth it. Life in Pinecrest Meadows also changed. The once distant neighbors began to see her not just as another resident, but as a leader. Claire accepted invitations to community events, where she spoke about resilience and unity. At one of these gatherings, a young mother approached her with tears in her eyes, thanking her for her courage and for helping create a safer environment for her children. Claire responded with a quiet smile, assuring her that real change came from collective action. Over time, her home in Pinecrest Meadows became a symbolic place. School groups visited to learn about her story, and local activists sought her guidance. Claire, though grateful, kept a simple life, focusing on her personal peace and the bonds she had built with the community. One afternoon, while sitting on her porch, a neighbor approached with a proposal. They wanted to rename the local park in her honor, as a tribute to her bravery and the positive impact she had had on the community. Claire, though honored, requested that the park be given a name that symbolized unity and change rather than focusing on a single person. The result was the Justice and Equality Park, a space dedicated to reflection and learning. The incident that had begun as an act of prejudice and abuse had transformed into a force for change. Claire, looking back, understood that the most significant battles were not always fought on distant battlefields, but in the everyday corners of life. And though she knew the work was never truly finished, she felt at peace knowing she had taken a firm step toward a better future. Do you want to hear more inspiring stories like this? Then leave a like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss anything. And let's talk in the comments. Where are you watching from? We'd love to know.